Hello, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us for our Lunch and Learn at the Eisenhower Presidential Library. Of course, I'm Joy Murphy, the Director of Learning and Engagement. This month, October, is U.S. Archives Month, and we are an archive here at the Eisenhower Library. And so we'd like to take a moment to introduce you to our staff, and particularly our archival staff, and show you what we do here at the Eisenhower Library with this short video.
The Eisenhower Presidential Library, along with all the presidential libraries in the National Archives and Records Administration system, promote an understanding of the presidency and the American experience. We preserve and provide access to historical materials by supporting research and creating interactive programs and exhibits that educate and inspire. Tens of thousands of visitors come to the Dwight D. Eisenhower Presidential Library Museum and Boyhood Home each year. They tour Dwight's boyhood home, explore the museum, stroll the beautiful 22-acre campus, and visit the place of meditation, which is Ike and Mamie's final resting place. Visitors entering the library are often surprised when they do not see rows of book-lined shelves. We often get asked, where are the books? Well secured behind these marble walls is the true significance of the library, the archives. Each presidential library is a one-of-a-kind collection of original documents, photographs, audio recordings, and films which are carefully preserved. This makes us different from a public library where you can borrow books. Our holdings are non-circulating, but are available to on-site researchers, and everyone, including you, has access to these holdings.
As a supervisory archivist, I serve as the caretaker of the documentary legacy of the 34th President, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and oversee the archives operations. As we collect new materials, my team organizes and preserves these document collections, always with the focus of providing researchers access. We have the privilege of connecting people to history, enabling them to converse with historical figures. To me, research is an interactive process with the holdings, not just the passive absorption of information. Because the library contains primary source materials, you're able to hear directly from these people, free of someone else's biases, filters, judgments, or conclusions. It is thrilling to see the process unfold as researchers experience the magic of a moment of discovery. When you dive into these records, you find that there is always something new. There are always mysteries to solve, and history becomes very exciting. The research conducted here produces a range of results, from Student History Day projects to best-selling books, movies, and documentaries, and even deeper understandings of one's personal story. I love helping people make these connections, introducing them to new possibilities, and interacting with them on their journey.
As museum curator, my team and I focus on preserving the artifact collection and creating new and meaningful ways for our visitors to learn from and interact with the exhibits. It's important to me to make this history accessible so people can understand the true story of Ike and Mamie, their challenges, successes, and even their occasional failures. Part of this involves developing, designing, and installing exhibits which bring new information to our visitors in engaging and meaningful ways. In one sense, it would be tempting to seal away these one-of-a-kind artifacts in a perfectly controlled environment to keep them safe. But we're always balancing the necessity of preservation with the importance of presentation so that the meaning of these artifacts is not lost to current and future generations. It's a true pleasure to see visitors interact with an exhibit and overhear conversations as they're taking in the information. It's important for us to provide all of our guests with the opportunity to learn, engage with their own history, and experience something new and meaningful.
I love discovering new things as I create programs for the library. Working with this treasure trove of information we have available provides inspiration for new topics and supplements the presentation that our guest speakers bring to our audience. The relationship between education, archives, and the museum is paramount to program development. Collaborating with the archive and curatorial teams helps to discover little-known facts about Ike and Mamie. The excitement created from these interactions is what drives the development of new public programs. The most rewarding part of my job is to see those light bulb moments occur when all the hard work of research comes together, or the moment when they find their place in the story. Being a part of creating this experience for our guests is what it's all about.
As you can see, the unique content of the Presidential Library provides an unvarnished look into Dwight D. Eisenhower's life, his legacy, and important aspects of our history as American citizens. The content stored in the library has important stories to tell, with personal lessons for all of us. For example, I connect deeply with a document that we call the In Case of Failure message. This note, handwritten by General Eisenhower, states that the service members involved in the Normandy invasion made every possible preparation, and if the invasion were to fail, it would be Eisenhower's failure alone. These words really speak to the character of Eisenhower and inspire me to strive for the same ideals. As you explore the history contained in the library, whether it be in the research room poring over the documents, exploring the exhibits, or engaging in our many public programs, you'll likely find something that speaks powerfully to you as well.
One of the most important aspects of the Eisenhower legacy from my perspective is Ike the citizen. Understanding how he lived his life as an American citizen helps us to grasp who he was as a man, a general, and a president. In his book, At Ease, Ike shares the story about the first time he saw the flag unfurled as a cadet at West Point. He says at that moment he knew his life would be about something bigger than himself. Throughout his life, Eisenhower was insistent on being a productive, contributing member of society and believed others should do the same. The ideal doesn't always mean you're successful, but it does, as citizens, challenge us to aspire to something beyond personal accomplishment. And I think for Ike, that was paramount.
To me, it is important that we show the world who President Eisenhower was and the relevancy of his decision-making and action on the world today. Part of that includes the fact that Ike was not a perfect man, but his imperfections did not prevent him from becoming a great leader. In fact, I would argue that being flawed and being conscious of his flaws helped propel him into the leader he became. I want people to see that Eisenhower was a student of life, and like Ike, we should never stop learning.
I'd like to think that Ike and Mamie would appreciate and approve of the work that is being done here to preserve their legacy and to tell their story. As a temporary steward of these priceless artifacts, it is an honor to care for their memories. This is a unique place that in a very real sense encompasses the whole of Ike's life, from his childhood through his military and presidential careers to his final resting place. This is a special and fitting tribute, and our ongoing mission is to preserve this story and share it with future generations.
All the work we do has one primary goal, whether it's caring for the documents and artifacts, sharing information through exhibits, or providing educational programming. Everything is dedicated to making access happen for the public, both today and for many generations to come. In perpetuity, in fact. There is true power in engaging with our history, and it is vital to understanding the human condition.
We are very proud of the work that we do here at the Eisenhower Library, and we hope that we make his family proud as well. Now on to our Lunch and Learn program. If this is your first time joining us our 2023 annual theme is Difficult Decisions. All year we've been exploring tough decisions made during the Eisenhower administration. Today we are pleased to welcome Christopher Coes, Assistant Secretary of Transportation for Transportation Policy. He will be talking to us about difficult decisions of where to build the interstate, the impact of these decisions, and the future of the interstate. Mr. Coes, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you to you, Joy, for having me here today on behalf of Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg. Again, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christopher Coes. I have the distinct privilege and honor to serve as the Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy here at the Department of Transportation. In a nutshell, my job is to help guide the department's implementation of legislation such as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as the American Rescue Plan. I bring over 20 plus years experience in my career advancing equitable land use and economic development, transportation, as well as a degree of work in environment as well as innovation. Prior to joining the administration, I was a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute and served for over 10 years as vice president at a nationally recognized organization called Smart Growth America. Again, I'm just really excited for the opportunity to discuss the history of the interstate highway system, the legacy of President Eisenhower, where we are today, and where we hope to go in the future. I do have a presentation, and so I will ask my colleagues to go to the next slide. The story of Eisenhower and the national interstate system has to start well before Eisenhower ever assumed the presidency or even considered public office. When then Dwight Eisenhower was captain in the U.S. Army, he joined the 1919 Motor Transport Corps as part of the Transcontinental Motor Convoy. Their job was to test the Army's capacity to traverse the nation by automobile from here in Washington, D.C., where I am today, all the way to Oakland, California. Could you guess what the average speed on the trip was? 5 miles per hour. So I guess you can imagine after another great war and his assumption of the presidency, Eisenhower had a unique understanding of the needs that the nation needed a highway system. Eisenhower knew that a nationwide highway would enable the public defense, support the national movement of goods, and really revitalize and actually in many ways strengthen economic growth. He thought that a highway system would unify the country through a trans-regional economic opportunity and of access. Next slide. As you can imagine, like any good major project, the development of the interstate highway system took some time. Eisenhower was a key player at a critical moment in its history. But by the time he came into office, there were nearly 2 decades of public discourse and studies about the development of the nationwide system. In the late 1930s, the Federal Aid Highway Act includes a study of a highway network that proposed a master plan for the interstate system. Congress was not immediately moved. In 1941, President Roosevelt conducted a second study. For those concerned that we in government spend too much time planning, know that we have a good president set by our greatest American leaders in planning and considering our options before making significant investments. In 1941 was a really tough year to release a massive study because there was a lot of national tension, really focused on more pressing issues of global security as U.S. was engaged in World War II. At the end of the Second World War, President Roosevelt was able to fund the designation of over 40,000 miles of the national highway system. But I have to be honest with you, very little was built. States and the federal government really struggled to set up appropriate funding matches to develop the system. And it's within this context that in 1956, President Eisenhower was once again, through his leadership, was able to appropriate funding for the federal highways and turnpikes. He created the Highway Trust Fund as a mechanism for highway users, taxes specifically, that would actually help support the completion of the system. The story of the national highway system probably becomes more familiar to all of us after this point. We live today with the fruits of President Eisenhower's labor, with President Roosevelt's vision, and the work of so many state and local leaders who work together to connect the nation. Since 1956, we've seen the passage of the National Environmental Policy Act, the impacts of civil rights movement, and climate science on the relationship with the interstate highway system. But before we get into that, I think it's more to understand about why the system was built under Eisenhower's leadership in the way that it was built. Next slide. The 3 main reasons US leaders at the time were really bent on developing an interstate system was around the national security, economic growth, and safety. First, national security. National security was paramount for Eisenhower. The interstate system was developed during the Cold War, immediately following the two world wars. President Eisenhower considered the system a matter of national security. He has seen firsthand the limitations and the security concerns of defending the US without the interstate system. He knew that an interstate could provide efficient transportation for the military in case of an emergency or a conflict, allowing for the rapid movement of troops, equipment, and supplies across the country. Second, the interstate system aimed to boost the economic growth by facilitating the efficient movement of goods and people. And the system was intended to move people even further. And third, the interstate was specifically intended to help increase roadway safety. At that time, many roads across the country were inadequate for the growing number of vehicles, leading to heavy traffic, accidents, and deaths. The new system was designed with safety in mind, featuring limited access, well-engineered roadways, and controlled access points to reduce accidents. The system had other benefits too. A shared interstate meant standardized signage and rules of the road, which made it easier for road users to travel long distances. Even as someone who grew up in Southwest Georgia, knowing firsthand that highways made rural areas less remote and made urban areas more accessible to out-of-towners and connecting to people previously hard to reach. And I'm always reminded of those great Chevrolet commercials that says, see USA in your Chevrolet. Next slide. But we know that the benefits don't always fund a public system, and the highway system had to be funded. One of Eisenhower's major hurdles was how to fund the highway system. In response, he proposed the creation of the Highway Trust Fund. The trust fund was meant that the federal government funded 90% of the cost to complete the interstate system. Today, the federal government continues to play a significant role in funding the construction and the maintenance of the interstate highway system. The Federal Highway Trust Fund is still the primary source of funding, but this funding, unfortunately, has to get replenished beyond just our current taxes on gasoline. Proceeds from the fund goes way beyond now, just from Federal Highway. It also goes to support transit projects. But in addition to the Federal Trust Fund, we now have states who have their share of formula dollars. About 2/3 of those funds of Department of Transportation funds go through formula. But then the federal government allocates the remaining of our discretionary grants to states who compete to demonstrate how their projects align with priorities like sustainability and economic development. States and local governments then, on top of the federal funding, have added their own state gas tax, federal registration fees, tolls, and other user fees and bonds. They bundle all of these types of funding together for these projects. In many cases, we've increasingly seen private partners, developers, work with local governments on these projects. Next slide. Now, then there's the question of where projects were built while Eisenhower was at the helm and through today. The federal government actually selected point-to-point routes for the interstate highways. Then state DOTs, Department of Transportations, determined on-the-ground location of those freeways. There are two key issues that continue to have what I would say an outsized impact on our communities and the policy making up to this day, particularly redlining and the post-World War II housing boom. As it relates to redlining, as many of you know, in the 1950s, on the back of, unfortunately, formal and unconscious segregation policies across the country, government home ownership programs determined which neighborhoods could have Black and brown, minority, or other underserved homeowners. This practice was called redlining. Many factors affected the location of the interstate system, but one that rises to the top, particularly for underserved and Black or brown neighborhoods, were often proven to be the location of choice. Too often, the federal government, in partnership with state and local governments, deemed Black and brown neighborhoods and communities as risky for investments. These neighborhoods then were underinvested in and easier to identify the relocation of to be replaced by the highway system. The impact of this was unfortunately the destruction of many historic immigrant, Black, brown communities across the United States, and also the loss of potential of wealth and wealth creation for those families. But on the inverse, there was a massive demand for housing. Simultaneously, at the end of World War II and the GI Bill meant a massive housing boom. Over 30 million single-family homes were built in the post-war era. Millions of veterans returning home took advantage of the Veterans Administration and the Federal Housing Administration home loan programs, which allowed individuals to move into new homes in the suburban context, which sadly, unfortunately, had additional convents that barred other underserved communities from buying. These new suburban communities, while were further from jobs and schools, but they had great access because of the interstate highway to so many great destinations. The interstate system served as an opportunity for America to create a new class of housing, suburban housing, to reach new destinations by bypassing many of those communities. Now, next slide. The interstate system leaves us today with a very interesting and in many ways forward-thinking legacy. We have built our communities because of our investment in our highway system to be very much car-centric. As I mentioned before, one of the legacies and in many ways marvels of the Eisenhower legacy around the interstate system is that we were able to create standardization. But as you can probably imagine, sometimes we might have went too far. Some of the lessons that we learned on designing our interstate highways became into our own neighborhoods, such that a lot of our neighborhoods today are sprawling, making it very challenging to have your children and mom or grandma to walk or bike or connect to people or to your destinations by bus or rail. Because of practices like redlining or exclusionary housing, we've unfortunately have codified some of the racial, economic, and class disparities, making it challenging to meet and work with people who are different than all of us and concentrating resources in certain areas while leaving others sparse. We have now encroached on the underlying national landscape. We are building housing closer to fire risk and flood zones. And with each mile of distance between our homes, our jobs, our schools, we are also inadvertently increasing our air pollution as well as our greenhouse gas emissions through our driving. What's more, our highway infrastructure, including thousands of miles of asphalt, pavement, and bridges, are incredibly expensive to maintain. And we know that our roadways and bridges need more maintenance across the country, and that need continues to grow today. Next slide. So while the interstate construction program ended in the 1990s, today, state departments of transportation initiate most of the interstate highway construction with the help of the Federal Highway Administration. In the 1960s, Congress passed what was called the National Environmental Policy Act, which we like to call NEPA. That act requires both the review of potential environmental impacts for any project and a strategy to limit or avoid those environmental justice impacts. The review process also calls for public involvement to identify local concerns based on community residents or community businesses. And that NEPA public engagement process specifically calls for the attention to projects in communities that have been historically underserved or uninvested as a way to reduce any further harm to those communities. I think globally, one of the legacies from the interstate system is that NEPA is one of the ways that we at Department of Transportation, but also as a federal government, is trying to understand and respond to the challenges, but also the opportunities truly baked in the U.S. transportation system. Next slide. So far, I've spoken as if the interstate system was just simply built to meet the needs of certain people. We all know that transportation drives development. The story around infrastructure and transportation is very complicated. The relationship between transportation and development is bidirectional. As much as development of economic zones and housing and school drives where we need to go, our transportation system also drives where development of those resources go as well. And in our view, if you're getting everywhere by a car, a drive-through on your way home seems like an attractive option. So does a drive-in movie. If you're driving to pick up your kid from school or make sure they get their ballet lesson, your first question, where can I park? Also, for that ballet studio or that public school system, their first question would be, how can we make sure there's enough parking? How can we make sure that there's a kiss and ride lot that's big enough for all the parents? Now, all of a sudden, your entire downtown district is full of parking lots and kissing rides and drive-throughs. Even if you remember as a child the joys of walking to school, increasingly now, if you wanted to walk to school or to that ballet studio, you can't. It's uncomfortable and too often unsafe to walk 2 miles on roads primarily built and designed for cars. But we don't necessarily live in an exclusively drivable world. On the other hand, we know that developing a transportation network of roads and bridges with transit through a complete streets framework, which allows you to have multiple transportation options, opens the door to walkable urbanism, whether it's along our rural main streets, our suburban town centers, or even our great urban cores. The thought that you can walk from school to an after-school lesson or bike or scooter, or if you're in a wheelchair or a motorized chair, that there's room on the street for you too. If your destination is more than 5 minutes away, that you might can hop on a light rail or a bus or a subway. And if you need to reach a destination that's even more remote, that you maybe even take a share ride or even drive. Our transportation and the way we invest in transportation shapes us, shapes our lives, shapes our community. Next slide. As we now look nearly 50 to 60 years later, the interstate system and how we've been thinking about transportation presents us not only with new challenges, but some really interesting opportunities. While highways made it easier for individuals in suburbia to get to the downtown core, we also saw that many communities, particularly in the late 70s, 80s, and early 90s, that our downtowns were being hollowed out. Lack of economic opportunity. Many cities saw a lot of the jobs leave from the suburbs and subsequently saw a decline in tax revenue, contributing to a vicious cycle that made and created decades, really would take decades to reverse. But interesting enough, in the 1990s, we began to see many of those jobs come back to more of your rural main streets, so your suburban downtowns, or places that actually had multiple options of getting around neighborhoods. We also see as in terms of a challenge, like many communities that, especially those that were bisected by highways, found themselves worst off, often disconnected from job centers, goods and services, and overall reduced transportation options. We also know now that every mile driven is both tailpipe fuel from gas-powered vehicles and also creates more pollution. Children who live closer to highways have a disproportionate higher rates of asthma. Simply put, more highways, more parking, more car-centric infrastructure has given rise of questions around how do we ensure that we can actually create a transportation system that helps public health and ensures that no matter where you live, we have strong economic growth. Next slide. Another major concern over the last several years, as we think post the interstate system itself, is that is around safety. At the Department of Transportation, our North Star is safety. Whether you're riding a car, walking down the street, taking a flight on a plane, we want to make sure that you can get where you're going and back safely. But sadly, since 2017, the average US county experienced over 61 roadway fatalities. In your county right now, that is 61 mothers, fathers, teenagers, children, friends, church members who are dying on our roadways. The top 50 counties with the highest fatalities in the country account for 24% of all fatalities. Roadway fatalities was on the decline, but for the last decade has been steady on the rise, and primarily with the fact that over 42,000 individuals dying in 2021, we at the Department of Transportation believe this is a crisis and it's unacceptable. Next slide. One of the other challenges that we are beginning to see in our transportation system is that increasingly American households are spending a lot of money on transportation related costs. On average, a household can spend over $11,000 a year on transportation related costs. For many low income families, that means spending over half of their monthly income on housing and transportation expenses. And sadly, in some parts of the country, that cost is even higher. In certain areas with high living costs and limited transportation options, we are seeing the data is showing that low-income families spend as much as 80% of their monthly income and on the combined cost of transportation and housing. So imagine getting to a school as a young person, or getting to work or a doctor's visit, or essential social services are absolutely non-negotiable, especially for low-income families. But purchasing or maintaining a car or living in a community that doesn't have multiple options can be incredibly expensive. Furthermore, many low-income people today are moving and living in exurbs to find affordable housing much farther away from job centers, and are increasingly finding the lack of easy access to amenities because, again, the housing is cheaper in those areas. And unfortunately, whether in exurbs or rural areas, they oftentimes have limited and unsafe and no opportunities for biking, walking, taking public transit, again, all increasing transportation costs. Next slide. As you can see here, this really illustrates particularly how low-income housing families are spending over 37% after-tax income on transportation. Next slide. I also would like to take the moment to talk about the climate impacts of our transportation system. Addressing our greenhouse gas emissions is by far one of the most important into mitigating the worst impact of the climate crisis, like extreme weather events and rising sea level rises. Facing the climate crisis is an opportunity to address not only our environmental challenges, but also position America to be an economic leader in the future. Driving, sometimes, as I noted before, can create more greenhouse gas emissions, can lead to greater pollutants that can lead to greater asthma. But we have a unique opportunity by reducing pollution in the transportation system, also improves air quality, improves the quality of life, but more importantly, it also strengthens our economic security as it decreases our reliance on foreign oil. Between 1980 and 2023, there have been over 42 confirmed flooding events with losses exceeding $1 billion each, leading to disruption of our railways, our bridges, our rails, and other transportation infrastructure. And so now it's becoming increasingly clear that we are going to protect the legacy of President Eisenhower, and particularly the interstate highway system. We have to make sure that the system is more resilient to the changes in our climate. Next slide. As mentioned, globally, transportation is the second largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. But in the United States, because of our unique reliance on highway infrastructure, driving is our largest source of our emissions. Next slide. So where we decide to build has a profound impact on so many communities, particularly the underserved, whether it's Black or other minority communities, or even rural areas. Communities that are nearest to freeways and other industries are severely impacted by pollution. But that is not only damaging to the climate, but also is creating massive health outcomes. I think you're probably getting now that housing and transportation policies are extremely linked. Where we're placing housing contributes to maybe our car dependency. It contributes to our increased vehicle miles travel and becomes the greatest source of our greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution. By focusing on multimodal investments, we can improve air quality, improve health outcomes, and advance a transportation system that benefits all users. That is right. By giving citizens more transportation options, America is better off. Next slide. Now we've discussed how we got here, the history of the interstate system, Eisenhower's amazing vision, along with some of the challenges that the system presents to us today when considering climate and equity and economic access. What I would like to do now is focus on what we in the Biden-Harris administration think the future holds. President Biden has said that to maintain the strongest economy in the world, we need the best infrastructure in the world. And to that end, our president has championed the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the CHIPS and Science Act. Each of these laws seek to strengthen our economy by reinvesting and strengthening our infrastructure. But in the 21st century, we know that infrastructure is much more than the interstate highway system alone. And let's talk about that. Let's go to the next slide. As an administration, we are focused on reducing motor vehicle fatalities. We're focused on increasing transit ridership in our top transit cities. We're focused on reducing the $830 billion in highway repairs by 50% by 2040. We're focused on fixing our broken bridges. We're focused on ensuring that state DOTs and MPOs who are on the front lines of designing our transportation system are doing it in a way that centers community voices in those decisions. But also, we are focusing on ensuring that the transportation system can actually be less of a burden in household incomes and reducing overall emissions and pollution so that our communities can not only have cleaner air, better quality of life, but that the American public and this American economy can be a global leader in the clean energy revolution. Next slide. At the Department of Transportation, our mission is to deliver a world-leading transportation system serving the American people and the economy that is safe, that's efficient, that's sustainable, and is equitable to the movement of people and goods. As is laid out in our strategic goals, DOT's vision of a 21st century transportation system is not just going beyond the interstate system, it's integrating the interstate system into a larger system. Safety, as I mentioned, will always be the Department of Transportation's North Star. How do we go about advancing project safety and moving us closer to eliminating transportation-related injuries and fatalities on our highways and on our roads? How do we ensure that we have great economic strength and competitiveness? How do we ensure that DOT, we are investing in projects that reduce inequities across our transportation system? How do we ensure that we are focused on climate and sustainability by reducing greenhouse gas emissions? And how are we doing this in a way, much like President Eisenhower, looking to the future and making sure that we're investing in innovative solutions that not only meets today's challenges, but creates a system of the future that solves future challenges. Next slide. And that is why the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law of 2021 represents an unprecedented investment in this new multimodal future that helps create clean energy and really aspires a transportation sector decarbonization that will fuel economic growth and also revitalize and integrate our nationwide transportation infrastructure, including the interstate highway. In this way, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law signed by President Biden represents a continuation of the vision and the mission of President Eisenhower's National Interstate and Defense Highways Act in 1956. There are a couple things that the law does to directly address some of the problems we address. And with that, let's go to the next slide. A couple of things, as I mentioned, that this particular bill address. First, maintaining the system that President Eisenhower has laid out. As you all know, if you've gone down the highway, there might be some potholes, right? But maintaining the system is incredibly expensive. And that is why the bipartisan infrastructure law not only prioritizes repair of this existing infrastructure, but provides now more funding for highways since the inception of the interstate highway system. Now we are able to not only make our highway system more advanced, but also make sure that it survives and can be maintained for years to come. Next slide. Second, the bipartisan infrastructure law also begins to respond to some of America's most challenging history, particularly as it relates to highway development in communities. The bipartisan infrastructure law includes, for the first time ever, a program called Reconnecting Communities with $1 billion of funding over the next 5 years to help communities who may have interstate highways or rail lines. As you may know, you may have heard the common phrase, living on the other side of the railroad tracks. Now the bipartisan infrastructure law gives the administration, in partnership with state DOTs, local governments, and community groups, to do something about that. Next slide. The law also addresses the climate crisis by standing up a brand new joint office between the Department of Transportation and the Department of Energy to support the electrification, including the funding of carbon reduction strategies for states to reduce transportation emissions. In addition to transition to zero-emission vehicles and fuels, the U.S. National Blueprint for Transportation Decarbonization addresses all sources of transportation emissions by focusing on improving community design. So it allows you to be able to walk, bike from your home to your job so you can be able to live and play. But more importantly, also giving every American more options to move around efficiently, safely, and affordably around the built environment. Next slide. And finally, the law really supports the development of a more resilient and multimodal future. There is funding, as I said before earlier, for vehicle electrification, but there's also funding for transit electrification, facilities for creating for safer walking and biking in communities, and funding to help support development of allowing housing closer to transit. In many ways, in many places, we can achieve what people are now calling 15-minute neighborhoods, where basic needs like schools and food can all happen within a 15-minute walk or bike in your own neighborhood. More importantly, ensuring that Americans and businesses have safe, affordable, and reliable transportation options not only will reduce costs of foods and goods, but will help reduce the traveling costs for families who are too often burdened by transportation costs. Just as important are health implications. As mentioned previously, communities closer to our major highways and roadways are disproportionately burdened by climate and health impacts. By electrifying our cars, providing more clean and affordable transportation options, we are going to find huge benefits. And that's not everything that's in the law, but that's just to give you a sense of how holistic the vision is for the new transportation future in this moment under the leadership of President Biden. Next slide. It's also important to note that as we think about the future of the transportation system, including the interstate highway system, recognizing that this, with the hundreds of billions of dollars coming through the bipartisan infrastructure law, through the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as the CHIPS Act, the president has been very keen on ensuring that no American community is left behind. And that is why the president instituted what is called the Justice 40 Initiative, which is now a whole of government effort to ensure that federal agencies work with state and local government, as well as community residents, community organizations, and the private sector, to make sure that the President Biden's promise to ensure that 40% of the overall benefits of these federal investments in clean energy and climate support and transform disadvantaged communities. At the Department of Transportation, we've actually designated over 39 to 40 programs representing close to $200 billion in DOT funding to support Justice 40. After implementation of Justice 40, we're going to continue to work and ensure that DOT programs not only achieve the 40%, but actually ensure that all of our investments, highway investments, transit investments, pipeline investments, actually go to the improvement of these disadvantaged communities to convert them and transform them into truly thriving communities. Next slide. The federal government has been given a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to lead the EV revolution, and the rapid growth in EVs today is a part of the fundamental shift we're seeing in transportation, a change that promised substantial benefits to individuals, to businesses, communities, and the entire nation. As part of President Biden's administration's multi-pronged strategy to fight climate change and reach a net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, President Biden has set two major goals to make EVs more accessible to all Americans. The first is to build a convenient and an efficient public network of 500,000 public EV chargers to support local and long distance trips. Yes, you heard that right. 500,000 public EV chargers up and down the interstate highway system for both long and distant trips. And the second part of the strategy is to make sure that nearly half of all new vehicles sold in the US in 2030 are zero emission vehicles. Let me repeat that. The second prong of our strategy, in addition to building out 500,000 EV chargers along the interstate highway, is to make sure that half of all vehicles sold in the US in 2030 are zero emission vehicles. But it doesn't just stop there. It's ensuring that American citizens can have access to building those cars here in America, building those EV chargers here in America. So the electrification of the interstate highway, building out our network for local and long distance trips, and our manufacturing capability is a job creation opportunity, much like President Eisenhower's legacy around the interstate highway itself. Although we are putting fast charging along the highway corridors, it's getting a lot of attention, and for good reason. We're also equally focused on ensuring that community chargings will be the linchpin of our national charging network. The vast majority of our charging needs will be for the public, conveniently located, level 2 charging in both large and small, urban and rural communities where people live, work, and play. The electrification of the interstate highway also provides us a unique opportunity to actually use the existing right-of-way to do the electrification for rail and other electric expansion of our transmission as well. So in summary, it's a win-win. Next slide. We talked about the need to address our stalled progress on roadway fatalities. Recognizing the need to act, we released the Roadway Safety Strategy in January of 2022. Since then, we have launched a call to action where we're asking government at all levels, law enforcement, industry, nonprofits, advocacy organizations, researchers, and beyond to do their part to implement the safe systems approach to make sure that our streets and our highways are safe for people. Next slide. So as we think about how we're going to achieve this vision, achieving a transportation system that advances community-driven projects through a bottom and middle-out approach has really meant that the administration had to think about how do we design our programs, particularly our discretionary grants, to get in the hands of those regions and local governments. Subject to appropriation, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law has provided over $45 billion in new competitive grants. And with the growth of self-help cities and communities, both in rural, suburban, and rural areas, we as administration want to see communities leverage these programs to advance projects that improve mobility, expand economic opportunities, support housing at all income levels, and address the climate change and economic challenges, and so much more. Now, In closing, we'll take a look at some of the programs that are really designed to help accelerate this bottom-up and middle-out approach in investing in our transportation system. Next slide. As it was noted, understanding that we must take a whole of government approach, the Department of Transportation created what is called the Thriving Communities Initiative. This initiative is the first time where the Department of Transportation, working with state DOTs and MPOs, but now with local governments, who particularly those communities that have been adversely impacted by infrastructure or economic decisions made in the past, to actually design and create a pipeline of transformative, community-driven infrastructure and mobility projects across the country. And these projects are designed to do things like economic growth, increase affordable transportation and housing options, build resiliency, improve workforce development, improve accessibility, but more importantly, ensure that every person and every place has an opportunity to thrive. And this initiative is one of our ways to create these place-based technical assistance. In our first round of this program, we created 3 major community of practice: Main Street, which is primarily focused on rural and tribal communities; Complete Neighborhoods, which is focused on urban and suburban connectivity and equitable transit-oriented development; and our last cohort, Network Communities, which is really focused on communities that have airports or ports or other intermodal challenges. Through this collaboration, the Department of Transportation is now going a step further to say, how can we work as a whole of government? We are now in partnership with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, Department of Commerce, the Health and Human Resource Agency, and the Department of USDA, Rural Development, and asking ourselves, how can we, as a federal government, speak with one voice, working in collaboration with local governments, working in collaboration with residents to truly build that pipeline and meet them where they are. Next slide. Now, I'm really excited just to talk about 2 examples of how the bipartisan infrastructure law, focusing on a bottom-up, middle-out, community-driven approach. I really want to take this opportunity to take a look at 2 communities awarded grant funding recently that address some of the issues we've discussed in this presentation. In February, we had a distinct honor to announce our first round of awards through our Reconnected Communities program, which included Long Beach, California, not too far from where you are today. The city was awarded $30 million to reconfigure the Shoreline Drive, which today is a major barrier to community assets, and it's also a safety hazard for those seeking to reach not only the community park space, but also middle school and elementary schools nearby. The Shoreline Drive was historically part of California's interstate freeway network known as I-710, which was a post-World War II urban renewal project, which demolished the working class Magnolia and West Beach neighborhoods, removing homes and businesses and replacing them with an existing divided road that operates at highway speeds next to elementary and middle schools, next to parks. The project now, through this funding, will reconfigure the West Shoreline Drive to remove the roadway barrier and improve access and connectivity between downtown Long Beach and the public open space. This reconfiguration will allow for the creation of a new bike path, new pedestrian amenities, but also will smartly divert the highway traffic away from resident streets to the major roads. These changes would mean that people living around in this neighborhood no longer have to cross a 3-lane, 50-mile-per-hour roadway with no crosswalks. Next slide. As stated earlier, safety continues to be the Department of Transportation's North Star and central to the advances of transportation system of the future. The newly created Safe Streets and Roads for All program is a key program that supports mobility, shared mobility, the National Roadway Safety Strategy I mentioned earlier, but also supports local driven initiatives to prevent death and serious injury on our roadways. A great example of how a community is approaching safety is in Detroit. Recently, the city of Detroit was awarded $24.8 million in an implementation grant for roadway safety improvements. Wayne County, which includes Detroit, is among the top 50 counties in the nation, which has the combined account of 24% of all roadway fatalities in the United States. The fatality rate is 15.9 times higher than an average county. Detroit, through this grant, plans to address by implementing road diets, improving leading pedestrian intervals, and creating new bike lanes, and creating new pedestrian refuge islands. All because they actually had more highway design roads within the city. We know that this will save lives. Next slide. In closing, it has been an honor of a lifetime serving as Assistant Secretary of Transportation at the Department of Transportation. And the work that myself and the 54,000 colleagues at the Department of Transportation is really built on the vision and the foundation that President Eisenhower has made. And again, is one of the country's greatest achievements. As part of the Biden-Harris administration and working with Secretary Buttigieg, we want to continue to build not only the legacy, but on the system to make sure that it's more sustainable, ensures that it's more affordable, that it's safe, and ensures that Americans' prosperity can be guaranteed in the 21st century. Again, I really thank you all for the opportunity to share in this great conversation and look forward to partnering with you in many ways in years to come. With that, I'll turn it back over to you, Joy, for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. We are going to jump right into the questions, but I do want to encourage anybody who's watching us to type your questions in the chat, and hopefully we'll be able to get to them. So there is already one question from Ortis Cafe, which says, what are we doing to revitalize those communities that were negatively impacted by the interstate system?
Very great question. There are a number of things that we are doing to prioritize and revitalize those communities. First and foremost, one of the things that we're doing is actually putting money where our mouth is. As I mentioned before, the president championed the need to actually have dedicated funding to help reconnect those communities harmed by the interstate highway system. And as I mentioned in my remarks, we have now over $1 billion, but actually as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, we also got additional $3 billion, so $4 billion total to provide community organizations, nonprofits, local governments working in partnership with state DOTs to, one, do planning, to better understand what are the impacts, where are the challenges, and for those communities who are interested in designing and envisioning what happens if we wanted to bring down or remove or retrofit the existing highway that may be creating a barrier. So we're providing both planning grants as well as capital grants to help achieve that vision. But we're not just stopping there. In addition to those programs, we're also asking ourselves, with so much of our funding going to state DOTs, to transit agencies, and local governments, we also want to make sure that we're being smart in our planning. We don't want to create new communities that have new highway barriers or new roadway barriers. And so one of the things that we're doing is actually providing, for the first time, capacity building and technical assistance to local governments and community organizations, nonprofits who are in those communities so that they can have co-ownership in designing transportation projects, so that when we look 20, 30, 50 years from now, that our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren can say that the process that we went through did not bring harm, but actually brought benefit. And the last thing I'll mention is that we're using data. As I mentioned before, the president has created what is called the Justice 40 Initiative. It's a data-driven exercise where every agency now has identified disadvantaged communities. And we're asking ourselves and our grant recipients, for every dollar that you're putting into a community, articulate what is the benefit, what is potentially the harm, and show us how you're going to mitigate that. And that is something that we are really excited, working with our state DOTs, with our local governments, but also our grant recipients to ensure that we can follow that as well. So again, this is a whole of government, but it's actually a whole of country, because in many ways, we as residents business leaders to be a part of these conversations as well, because that's where a lot of decisions are being had today.
All right, thank you. I'm going to ask what is somewhat of a selfish question. I'm from North Florida, and
Where?
North Florida.
Oh,
And
I'm
so
from Thomasville, so that feels like that's around the corner from me.
right around the corner. I'm originally from Panama City. So, it is at least a 45-minute drive to get from Panama City to the interstate. And, we are land of the hurricanes. And so when it comes to evacuations and things like that, we have problems. So what plans are being made, and it's a two-part question, what plans are being made to give better access for places that are fairly far from the interstate? We also have this problem in Kansas. But also, I'm going to also add that I do know that they're building a flyover from I-10 to Panama City, but it is going right through the rural community that my family is from, who also have to travel quite a ways to get to work and places. And so, but they won't have access to this flyover. So how are these decisions being made? What's being done to give better access to the interstate?
That is a really great question. As someone who too grew up along the I-10 corridor and just a few miles from the I-75 corridor, recognized the challenge of moving some what may be remote locations or rural communities out of harm's way, particularly during whether it's a hurricane or other natural disasters. And our approach here is multi-pronged. First and foremost, whether you remember the images during Hurricane Katrina, or even just most recently Hurricane Michael that came through Mexico, Florida, up to Southwest Georgia. One of the challenges was getting goods and resources in and out. And from our perspective, it is how do we make sure we give resources to local governments who are best positioned to make those decisions. And I think one of the things that we've learned as part of the through the bipartisan law is that we need to get more dollars out of Washington, but actually getting in the hands of local governments. And so our hope is that through the local governments who are working, who are really close in our front line, can actually ensure that you have innovative transportation and mobility options. One of the things I saw most recently in North Carolina Department of Transportation, they recognize that in many cases when these natural disasters are happening, many residents don't have the resources to just pick up and move. Or in many cases may not even have the ability to own a car. So they're thinking an innovative approach of providing shared mobility. And one of the things they're doing is through a $13 million grant through the Department of Transportation, they're actually partnering with the private sector and some of the ride-share companies to provide mobility options for residents in 9 counties. And so the idea is that we can actually also transform what it means to move around our communities using and leveraging the interstate. So that's another option. But of course, I can't just emphasize the fact that, as I mentioned before, we're making the largest investment in roads and bridges since the creation of the interstate. But we're also equally putting the most funding in transit, and particularly rural transit. So the idea that you can have micro mobility, you can have vans, and it has a greater accessibility to get you in and out around your community, but also in a time of crisis to be able to move you out. That also brings me to another point in terms of accessibility, is that this is why the interstate system is so important, but also thinking about how we integrate the full system. Because when one part of the system breaks, you want to be able to have other options. And that's one of the reasons why we're making significant investments in passenger rail. And I know specifically, since Joy, you brought up the I-10 corridor, we just announced a multi-million-dollar grant to reopen the Amtrak line that will connect residents from New Orleans, from Baton Rouge, all the way through up to Alabama, and hopefully will reconnect in from Mobile through Panama to Jacksonville. So the idea that citizens, regardless of where their background, what their mode, they have multiple options to get around and have access to jobs, healthcare, and access, that's affordable. And that's our goal. And that's the future. But you also bring up another point. There are obviously projects now that are underway. And that's one of the things I brought up the point in terms of things that we've learned since the inception of the interstate highway system in the 1950s and 60s. We now have the civil rights laws, we have our environmental review laws, which really helps not only the federal government, but also helps states and locals work with communities to make sure that these investments, whether it's a flyover, right, are not creating more environmental or other economic harms. And if they do, that we acknowledge them and actually try to fix them, or in some cases, come up with a different approach. And it's our hope and it's our responsibility at the Department of Transportation to ensure that our grant recipients are following the rules and regulations. And that is different. But one of the things I also would note that this is, in terms of process, transportation system design, is where you, regular citizens, you know, for me, and my secretary says this a lot, but for us to get invited to go speak to Congress about an issue, we have to be invited. But for many of you, you can just walk to your city council meetings, to your MPO meetings, where you can voice your concerns and your aspirations. And so in many ways, what we're finding as part of this new era of investment in our transportation system is an empowerment of all of you. And so the more your voices are heard, the more that you will see projects, investments reflect them as well.
All right. Well, Orders Cafe has another question, which actually goes along with the question I had and something you mentioned, and that is there's a push, of course, for better train systems. If you ever spent any time in Europe, you know what that's like, that they have great train systems. So is there a plan for better train systems, and how does that plan impact road systems? And Orders Cafe specifically asked about high-speed rail.
Look, sometimes you might have heard the president say that the bipartisan infrastructure law was a BFD, a big freaking deal. But it was. And to this question, it really, again, as I said before, this administration and the president has been very keen on ensuring that America has a leading global infrastructure system. And leveraging what we've learned through President Eisenhower's legacy around the interstate highway system, recognizing that it requires federal commitment, the bipartisan infrastructure law does that, not only in our highway system, but also in passenger rail. And as I mentioned before, the bipartisan infrastructure law put the largest investment in highways since the highway system was created, the highest level of funding in public transportation since the creation of public transportation, but it's also putting the largest investment in creating passenger rail. And we have two major programs called the Federal State Partnership Program, which one part of that program focuses on the Northeast Corridor, and the second program is focused on the national. And we are right now going through a process for over $20 plus billion to support passenger rail expansion across the country, in addition to supporting new corridors where communities are thinking about expanding either passenger rail or high-speed rail. And one of the things that's really amazing about the moment in time is that a lot of the applications we're seeing are actually leveraging the existing interstate highway system, what is the existing right-of-way. Or they're also asking themselves, how do we use the passenger rail system to reduce congestion on our highway system? And so in many ways, I believe this is a great opportunity for our local partners, working in partnership with the regional and state DOTs, to get this right. With the level of funding, we are very committed to ensuring that we have a robust passenger rail. I think you all know that President Biden is a pro-rail, pro-Amtrak. He's Amtrak Joe. Secretary is number 2. And everyone in my Department of Transportation are trying to fight to be number 3 in supporting that strategy. But we are at a precipice of a transportation revolution that creates an integrated process where you will see not only expansion of passenger rail that connects our urban and rural corridors, but also bringing some of the things that we've seen overseas in Asia and Europe, particularly high-speed rail, done here in America, but more importantly, not just brought here in America, but made in America, designed and built and maintained by American workers. And that is the vision around the bipartisan infrastructure law. And that's what we're seeking to do. And that, to me, is what's really exciting about being here today, because that is also what's the central point of the legacy of President Eisenhower as well.
Thank you so much. We are over time, so we're going to wrap it up here. But thank you for this wonderful, wonderful presentation and for answering our questions. And it's a topic that I know that we'll continue to be talking about. But we love Eisenhower here. We love the interstate highway system. We love to talk about it, and we have residents here in Abilene who remember when the interstate came through Kansas. So we like talks like this. So thank you so much.
No, thank you, Joy, and thank you to all of you for listening. And again, I really appreciate the opportunity to be in conversation and look forward to continuing conversation and journey together. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
All right, we do have a few announcements for anyone who is sticking with us. Our 2023 public programs are made possible by the Eisenhower Foundation and the Jeff Cope Memorial Foundation. So we are always incredibly grateful to them. So thank you for their support, their continued support. And then this actually wraps up our programming season for the year. However, we are known to sometimes have a few bonus programs throughout the year, or through the end of the year. And if you'd like to learn about those or be notified if we're having one, please join our email list. You can find the link to sign up on our website, eisenhowerlibrary.gov, and then click right there where the arrow says join our email list. Again, thank you all for joining us. We certainly appreciate you, and have a wonderful afternoon.